Margaret Williams sat behind her large wooden desk in the federal courthouse. The afternoon sun came through the tall windows of her office. She looked at the papers in front of her, but her mind was somewhere else. Today marked exactly 15 years since she first put on the black robe of a federal judge. The journey to this office had not been easy. Margaret was born in a small town in Alabama in 1975. Her parents were both teachers who fought for civil rights in the 1960s. They taught her that education was the key to changing the world. When Margaret was young, she watched her father get arrested for trying to register black people to vote. She saw her mother lose her teaching job for speaking out against unfair treatment of black students. These early memories shaped who Margaret became. She decided at age 12 that she wanted to be a lawyer. She wanted to use the law to help people who could not help themselves. Her parents saved every penny to send her to college. Margaret worked 3 jobs while studying. She cleaned offices at night, tutored other students, and worked at the library on weekends. Margaret was the first person in her family to go to college. She graduated at the top of her class from Alabama State University. Then came law school at Harvard. This was even harder. She was one of only a few black students in her class. Some professors ignored her when she raised her hand. Some classmates made cruel comments about affirmative action, but Margaret kept working. She studied harder than anyone else. She proved that she belonged there. After law school, Margaret worked as a prosecutor for 5 years. She sent criminals to jail, but always made sure they got fair trials. Then she became a defense lawyer for 3 years. She learned to see both sides of every case. This made her a better lawyer and later a better judge. In 2010, when Margaret was 35 years old, President Obama chose her to be a federal judge. She was young for such an important job. Some people said she was too young. Others said she was chosen only because she was black. Margaret proved them all wrong. On her first day as a judge, Margaret looked around her new courtroom. The walls were covered with pictures of old white judges who had worked there before her. She was the first black woman to sit in that chair. She promised herself that she would make them proud and make history at the same time. Margaret's courtroom became known for fairness. She treated everyone the same way, whether they were rich or poor, black or white. Lawyers respected her because she knew the law very well. She asked hard questions but always listened carefully to the answers. She never let anyone talk down to others in her courtroom. Over the years, Margaret handled many important cases. She sent corrupt politicians to prison. She protected the rights of workers who were treated unfairly. She made sure that companies followed environmental laws. She also handled family cases, helping children find safe homes and making sure parents paid child support. Other judges often asked Margaret for advice. She served on important committees that decided how courts should work. She traveled to other cities to train new judges. She wrote articles for law magazines. Her opinions were quoted by other judges across the country. Margaret also worked outside the courthouse. She started a program to help young black lawyers. Every year, she visited law schools to encourage minority students. She knew how hard it was to succeed in law when you looked different from most other lawyers. She wanted to make the path easier for others. The judge also worked with community groups. She spoke at churches and schools about the importance of following the law. She explained how the court system worked so regular people could understand it. She believed that everyone should know their rights. Margaret's personal life was good too. She married David, a doctor, in 2012. They bought a nice house in an upscale neighborhood near the courthouse. They had no children yet, but hoped to start a family soon. Margaret enjoyed cooking, reading mystery novels, and working in her garden on weekends. Her office walls showed her success. There were awards from bar associations, photos with important politicians, and certificates from legal organizations. Her law school diploma hung behind her desk. Next to it was a photo of her parents at her swearing-in ceremony. Her father had tears in his eyes that day. Her mother wore her best dress and a huge smile. Margaret kept a small photo on her desk of the Civil Rights March where her parents met in 1963. Sometimes she looked at it when making difficult decisions. She remembered that her parents fought for the right to be treated equally under the law. Now she was the one making sure that law was fair for everyone. The job was not always easy. Some cases kept her awake at night. She had to send people to prison for many years. She had to take children away from parents who hurt them. She had to make decisions that changed people's lives forever. But Margaret believed that justice was worth the hard work. She also faced challenges because she was black and female. Some lawyers tried to intimidate her, thinking she would be weak. They learned quickly that they were wrong. Margaret was tough when she needed to be. She held people in contempt of court when they were disrespectful. She made sure everyone followed the rules in her courtroom. Other judges respected Margaret's work. The chief judge often gave her the most difficult cases because he knew she would handle them well. Margaret was being considered for promotion to the appeals court. Her name appeared on lists of possible Supreme Court justices. She was building a reputation as one of the best judges in the country. That Tuesday afternoon, as Margaret finished reviewing cases for the next day, she felt proud of what she had accomplished. She had come a long way from that small town in Alabama. She had proven that hard work and fairness could overcome prejudice and doubt. Margaret turned off the lights in her office and gathered her briefcase. She had no idea that everything she had built over 15 years was about to change forever. She walked to her car in the courthouse parking garage, thinking about dinner with David and the cases she would hear tomorrow. The drive home usually took 20 minutes through the quiet streets of the city. Margaret often used this time to think about her cases or listen to the news on the radio. She felt safe and respected in her community. People knew who she was and treated her with the dignity that came with her position. As she drove toward her neighborhood that evening, Margaret Williams had no way of knowing that in just a few hours her entire world would be turned upside down by a chance encounter that would destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. Margaret Williams was driving home from a judicial conference that had run later than expected. The evening sky was turning dark as she traveled through the familiar streets toward her neighborhood. She had attended these conferences many times before. Tonight's meeting was about new court procedures and how to handle cases more efficiently. The conference had been productive. Margaret enjoyed talking with other judges about legal matters. They discussed difficult cases and shared ideas about how to improve the justice system. As one of the younger judges, Margaret often brought fresh perspectives that her older colleagues appreciated. Her black BMW moved smoothly through the quiet residential area. This was an expensive part of town where many professionals lived. Margaret and David had saved for years to buy their house here. The neighborhood had tree-lined streets, well-maintained yards, and good security. It was the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. Margaret was thinking about the dinner David was preparing when she heard a strange noise from her car engine. The sound grew louder as she drove. Then the engine started to shake. She pulled over to the side of Oak Street, a quiet road lined with large houses set back behind iron gates. The car made one final shuddering sound and died. Margaret tried to restart it several times, but nothing happened. She was stranded 2 miles from home. She looked around the empty street. There were no other cars in sight. The streetlights were just beginning to come on. Margaret reached for her cell phone to call David. Before she could dial, she decided to try calling roadside assistance first. She found the number for her car insurance company and explained her situation. The operator was polite and helpful. A tow truck would be there in about 45 minutes. While waiting, Margaret reviewed some case files she had brought home. She wanted to be prepared for tomorrow's hearings. The first case involved a man accused of stealing from his employer. The second was a civil rights lawsuit against a city police department. She made notes about legal questions she needed to research. 20 minutes passed quietly. Margaret was comfortable in her car with the doors locked. She had grown up in this city and knew it well. This neighborhood was particularly safe. Many judges, lawyers, and doctors lived here. Crime was almost unknown. Suddenly, bright lights appeared in her rearview mirror. A police car pulled up behind her BMW. Margaret felt relieved. The officer could provide security while she waited for the tow truck. She had worked with police officers for many years as a prosecutor and judge. They were usually professional and helpful. The patrol car's door opened. A tall white man in uniform approached her window. He appeared to be in his 40s with short brown hair and a serious expression. His name tag read, Officer D. Mitchell. Margaret had never seen him before, but she knew most officers in the city. Margaret rolled down her window and smiled. Good evening, officer. My car broke down and I'm waiting for a tow truck. Thank you for stopping to check on me. Officer Mitchell shined his flashlight directly into her face. The bright light hurt her eyes. License and registration, he said in a cold voice. He did not return her smile or acknowledge her explanation about the car trouble. Margaret was surprised by his unfriendly tone, but she remained polite. Of course. She reached into her purse for her wallet. Along with her driver's license, she pulled out her federal judge identification card. I'm Judge Margaret Williams from the federal courthouse downtown. Mitchell took her license, but barely. Glanced at the judge identification. What are you doing in this neighborhood? He asked suspiciously. The question confused Margaret. I live here. My house is about 2 miles away on Maple Lane. My car broke down and I'm waiting for roadside assistance. You live here? Mitchell's voice showed disbelief. He looked at her expensive car and back at her face. What kind of work do you do? Margaret remained calm, despite the officer's strange behavior. As I mentioned, I'm a federal judge. I've been on the bench for 15 years. Mitchell laughed in a way that was not friendly. Right. And I'm the mayor. He walked around her car, shining his flashlight at the license plates and windows. This is a nice neighborhood. Expensive cars get stolen and dumped here sometimes. Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but this is my car. The registration will show that it's registered to me. Margaret's voice stayed steady, but she was beginning to feel uncomfortable. The officer returned to her window. Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Is that necessary? I'm waiting for a tow truck, and I haven't done anything wrong. I said step out of the vehicle. Mitchell's hand moved to his belt where he kept his handcuffs and weapon. Margaret knew her rights, but she also knew that arguing with police officers on the street was dangerous, especially for black people. She had seen too many cases where simple traffic stops turned violent. She decided to cooperate and file a complaint later. She opened her car door and stood beside her BMW. The evening air was cool. She wore a navy blue business suit that she had worn to the judicial conference. Her appearance clearly showed that she was a professional person. Turn around and put your hands on the car, Mitchell ordered. Officer Mitchell, I need to ask why you're treating me this way. I'm a federal judge whose car broke down. I've shown you my identification and I'm waiting for roadside assistance. Mitchell's face grew angry. Don't tell me how to do my job. There have been reports of car thefts in this area. You match the description of a suspect. Margaret knew this was false. She was a middle-aged black woman in professional clothes driving her own car in her own neighborhood. She did not match the description of any car thief, but she also knew that challenging police officers could be dangerous. Officer, I understand you're investigating crime, but I'm not a criminal. I'm a sitting federal judge. If you have concerns, you can call the courthouse to verify my identity. Mitchell stepped closer to her. Are you telling me how to do my job? Do you think you're better than me because you have a fancy car? The situation was escalating in a way that made no sense. Margaret had dealt with difficult people in her courtroom for 15 years. She knew how to stay calm under pressure. But this felt different. This felt personal and dangerous. I'm not telling you how to do your job. I'm simply asking that you treat me with the same respect you would show any other citizen. Respect? Mitchell's voice grew louder. You people think you deserve special treatment. You think you can buy your way into neighborhoods where you don't belong. Margaret's heart started beating faster. The officer's words revealed his real motivation. This was not about car theft or neighborhood security. This was about race. She was being harassed because she was a black woman in an expensive neighborhood. Other cars began driving past. Margaret hoped someone would stop to help or at least witness what was happening. But the cars slowed down, looked, and kept driving. No one wanted to get involved in a police matter. Officer Mitchell, I'm going to remain calm and cooperate with you, but I need you to know that your behavior is inappropriate and I will be filing a complaint with your supervisor. This statement made Mitchell even angrier. You'll file a complaint? Against me? For doing my job? For harassing a citizen who has done nothing wrong? Margaret's phone rang inside her car. It was probably David wondering where she was, or maybe the tow truck driver saying he was on his way. She wanted to answer it, but she was afraid to make any sudden movements. Who's calling you? Mitchell demanded. Probably my husband. Or the tow truck company. Don't answer it. Keep your hands where I can see them. Margaret realized she was in serious trouble. This officer was not interested in the truth. He had decided she was a problem that needed to be handled. She had seen this kind of behavior before in cases that came to her courtroom. Police officers who let their prejudices control their actions. The minutes passed slowly. Margaret stood beside her car with her hands visible while Officer Mitchell seemed to decide what to do next. She thought about her parents and the civil rights struggles they had faced. She thought about the progress she believed had been made. And she wondered how a federal judge could be treated this way in America in 2025. What happened next would change everything Margaret Williams had worked for during her 15 years on the federal bench. The tension on Oak Street grew thicker with each passing minute. Margaret Williams stood beside her broken-down BMW, while Officer Derek Mitchell paced around her car like a predator circling its prey. The streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet residential road. Margaret's phone had stopped ringing, but she knew David would be worried when she didn't come home. Mitchell returned to where Margaret was standing. His face showed anger and something else that frightened her. It was the look of a man who had made up his mind about something dangerous. I'm going to search your vehicle, he announced. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Officer Mitchell, you don't have probable cause to search my car. I haven't committed any crime. My car broke down and I'm waiting for help. I have reasonable suspicion that this vehicle might be stolen, Mitchell replied. His voice was getting louder. The registration clearly shows that I own this car. You've seen my driver's license and my federal judge identification. There's no reasonable suspicion here. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. Are you a lawyer now? Think, you know the law better than me? I am a federal judge, I do know the law, and what you're doing right now is wrong. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret immediately knew she had made a mistake. In her 15 years on the bench, she had learned when to speak and when to stay quiet. But sitting in her broken car being harassed by a racist police officer, her frustration had gotten the better of her. Mitchell took a step closer. So you think you're better than me? You think your fancy title makes you special? I think the Constitution makes us all equal under the law, Margaret replied calmly. Including police officers. The Constitution? Mitchell laughed bitterly. You people hide behind the Constitution when it's convenient, but you don't respect the men and women who put their lives on the line to protect spoiled people like you. Margaret recognized the language. She had heard similar words in her courtroom from defendants who blamed their problems on everyone except themselves. But this was different. This man had a gun and a badge, and no one was watching except the empty street. Officer, I respect law enforcement. I've worked with police officers my entire career, but I also respect the rights that police officers are sworn to protect. Your rights? Mitchell's voice was full of disgust. What about my rights? What about my right to do my job without some uppity judge telling me how to do it? The word, uppity, hit Margaret like a slap. She had heard that word before growing up in Alabama. It was what white people called black people who they thought were getting too successful or too confident. Her parents had been called uppity for demanding equal treatment. Now she was being called the same thing for exercising her constitutional rights. I'm not telling you how to do your job. I'm asking you to do your job legally. Mitchell's hand moved to his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need backup at Oak Street and Elm. I have a suspicious person refusing to cooperate. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. Refusing to cooperate? I've answered all your questions and shown you my identification. You're arguing with me. That's obstruction. Having a conversation is not obstruction. I know the law, Officer Mitchell. There you go again, Mitchell shouted. Throwing your education in my face. You think you're so smart with your fancy degree and your federal judge job? Other police. Cars would be arriving soon. Margaret knew that once multiple officers were involved, the situation would become even more dangerous. Police officers often supported each other, even when one of them was wrong. She had seen it many times in court cases. Officer Mitchell, let's both calm down. When your backup arrives, they can verify my identity with the courthouse. This doesn't have to get worse. Worse? Mitchell stepped directly in front of her. You think this is bad? You have no idea what bad looks like. Margaret could smell alcohol on his breath. She wondered if he had been drinking. That would explain his aggressive behavior and poor judgment, but it also made him more unpredictable and dangerous. Sir, have you been drinking tonight? The question made Mitchell explode with rage. How dare you? How dare you accuse me of drinking on duty? You arrogant, stuck-up. He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but Margaret could see the racial slur forming on his lips. She had pushed him too far with her question about drinking, but she was a judge. She was trained to ask hard questions when something didn't seem right. I'm simply trying to understand why you're treating me this way, Margaret said quietly. You want to understand? Mitchell grabbed her arm roughly. I'll help you understand. Margaret tried to pull away. Officer, you're hurting me. Good, maybe now you'll learn some respect. Let go of my arm right now. You have no right to put your hands on me. I have every right. You're under arrest. For what crime? Resisting arrest. You can't arrest someone for resisting an arrest that has no legal basis. Margaret's legal training took over. Even in this dangerous situation, she couldn't help but point out how wrong Mitchell was. But her words only made him angrier. Shut up, he yelled. Just shut up with your legal talk. Margaret realized that everything she said was making things worse. But she couldn't stop herself from defending her rights. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice. She couldn't surrender now, even when she was scared. I will not shut up. I am a United States federal judge, and I demand to be treated with the respect that office deserves. That was the moment everything changed forever. Mitchell's face twisted, with pure hatred. Federal judge, you're nothing but an affirmative action hire who thinks she's white. Before Margaret could respond, his open hand struck her across the face with tremendous force. The sound echoed through the quiet street like a gunshot. Margaret stumbled backward against her car, her cheek burning with pain. You want respect? Mitchell screamed. Respect this! He raised his hand to hit her again, but Margaret ducked away. Stop, you're assaulting a federal judge. I don't see any federal judge, Mitchell shouted back. I see a black woman who needs to learn her place. The words that came out of his mouth next were the most vicious racial slurs Margaret had ever heard directed at her personally. Words that her parents had warned her about. Words that she thought educated people had stopped using. Words that cut deeper than the physical blow. Margaret touched her face where he had struck her. Her cheek was swelling and she could taste blood in her mouth. She looked at Officer Mitchell and saw something that terrified her. He wasn't done. He was preparing to hit her again. Please, she said quietly. Please don't do this. But as Mitchell raised his hand for a second blow, Margaret heard the sound of sirens approaching. 2 more police cars were racing toward them with their lights flashing. She didn't know if that would make her safer or put her in more danger. What she didn't know was that Officer Mitchell's body camera had recorded everything. Every word he said, every racial slur he used. The moment he struck a federal judge across the face, and within hours, that recording would be seen by millions of people around the world. Margaret Williams had just become the center of a national scandal that would destroy everything she had built over 15 years of faithful service to the law. The sirens grew louder as 2 police cars raced down Oak Street toward the scene. Margaret Williams stood beside her broken BMW, her left cheek swollen and throbbing from Officer Mitchell's blow. She could taste blood where she had bitten her tongue when he struck her. Her hands shook as she tried to process what had just happened. Officer Mitchell stepped back from Margaret as the backup units arrived. His angry expression suddenly changed to one of concern, as if he was trying to look like a professional police officer doing his job. But Margaret had seen his true face. She would never forget the hatred in his eyes when he called her those terrible names. The first backup car stopped with its lights still flashing. Sergeant Linda Rodriguez stepped out. She was a Hispanic woman in her late 30s who had worked with the police department for 12 years. Margaret had seen her testify in court several times. Sergeant Rodriguez was known for being fair and professional. The second car brought Officer James Park, a young Asian American officer who had joined the force only 2 years earlier. He looked nervous as he approached the scene. This was probably the first time he had responded to a backup call involving a federal judge. Sergeant Rodriguez walked quickly toward Margaret and Officer Mitchell. She could see that something was wrong. Margaret's face was clearly injured, and Mitchell looked like he was trying to control his anger. "What's the situation here?" Rodriguez asked. Mitchell spoke first. "I responded to reports of a suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood. The driver became hostile and resisted when I tried to investigate." Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. "That's not what happened at all. Officer Mitchell assaulted me because I identified myself as a federal judge." Rodriguez looked back and forth between them. She had known Mitchell for several years. He had a reputation for being aggressive, especially with minority citizens. There had been complaints before, but nothing had ever been proven. "Ma'am, can you tell me your name?" Rodriguez asked Margaret. "I'm Judge Margaret Williams from the United States District Court downtown. My car broke down and I was waiting for a tow truck when Officer Mitchell approached me." Rodriguez's eyes widened. She recognized the name immediately. Judge Williams was well known throughout the law enforcement community. She had a reputation for being tough but fair. Rodriguez had testified in her courtroom and respected her greatly. "Judge Williams, are you injured?" Rodriguez asked with concern. "Officer Mitchell struck me across the face when I asked him to treat me with respect." Mitchell interrupted angrily. "She's lying. She was resisting arrest and I had to restrain her." "Resisting arrest? For what crime?" Margaret asked. "I was sitting in my own car waiting for roadside assistance." Rodriguez could see the situation was serious. A federal judge was accusing one of her fellow officers of assault. This would require careful handling. She needed to document everything properly and make sure the truth came out. "Officer Mitchell, please step over here with me," Rodriguez said. She wanted to talk to him privately to hear his version of events. While Rodriguez spoke quietly with Mitchell, Officer Park approached Margaret. "Judge Williams, do you need medical attention?" Margaret touched her swollen cheek. "I think I should be examined by a doctor, but first I need to know if this incident was recorded." Park looked uncomfortable. He glanced toward Mitchell's patrol car. "All our units have body cameras and dashboard cameras. Everything should be recorded." Margaret felt a mix of relief and dread. The cameras would prove that Mitchell had assaulted her without cause, but they would also show the most humiliating moment of her professional life. She had been reduced to a victim of police brutality on a public street. Rodriguez returned from her conversation with Mitchell. Her expression was serious. "Judge Williams, I need to take statements from both of you. This will require a full investigation." "I understand, Sergeant. I want a complete investigation. I also want Officer Mitchell's body camera footage preserved immediately." "Of course. We'll secure all the evidence." Margaret's phone rang again. This time she answered it. David's worried voice came through clearly. "Margaret, where are you? Dinner is getting cold and you're never this late without calling." "David, I'm on Oak Street. My car broke down and there's been an incident with a police officer. Can you come pick me up?" "What kind of incident? Are you hurt?" Margaret looked at the 3 officers listening to her conversation. "I'll explain when you get here. Just come to Oak Street near Elm Avenue. I'm on my way right now." After Margaret hung up, Rodriguez continued gathering information. "Judge Williams, I need to ask you some detailed questions about what happened here tonight." Margaret told her story carefully and completely. She explained about the judicial conference, the car breakdown, calling for roadside assistance, and Officer Mitchell's arrival. She described his suspicious questions, his demand that she get out of the car, and his increasingly hostile behavior. "When I identified myself as a federal judge, he became angry. He made several racist comments and then struck me across the face," Margaret said. Rodriguez wrote everything down in her report. She had investigated many complaints against police officers. This one was different because it involved such a prominent victim. If Mitchell had really done what Judge Williams claimed, it would be a major scandal. Officer Park was examining Mitchell's patrol car. The dashboard camera was still running, and the body camera footage would be available for review. He knew that video evidence would be crucial in determining what really happened. Margaret noticed that other cars were starting to slow down as they passed the scene. Word would spread quickly that something had happened involving multiple police cars on Oak Street. In a few hours, reporters might start asking questions. Sergeant Rodriguez approached Mitchell again. "Derek, I need your version of events for my report." Mitchell's story was very different from Margaret's. According to him, he had responded to reports of car thefts in the neighborhood. When he found Margaret sitting in an expensive car, he became suspicious. He claimed she was uncooperative and hostile from the beginning. She started arguing with me when I asked for identification. Then she claimed to be some kind of judge. When I tried to investigate further, she became physically aggressive. "Physically aggressive how?" Rodriguez asked. She was waving her arms around and shouting. I had to restrain her for my own safety. Rodriguez knew this story didn't match what she could see. Judge Williams had an injury to her face, but Mitchell showed no signs of being attacked. Also, Margaret Williams was a small woman who posed no physical threat to a large police officer. David Williams arrived in his Mercedes, just as Rodriguez was finishing her initial interviews. He parked behind the police cars and rushed toward his wife. When he saw her swollen face, his expression turned to shock and anger. "What happened to you?" David demanded. "Officer Mitchell hit me," Margaret said simply. David looked at the three police officers. As a doctor, he could see that his wife had been assaulted. As a black man, he understood exactly what had happened here. His wife had been attacked by a racist police officer. "We need to get you to a hospital right away," David said. "I agree," Rodriguez replied. "Judge Williams should be examined by a medical professional. We'll also need photographs of her injuries for evidence." The tow truck finally arrived to pick up Margaret's BMW. The driver looked confused by all the police cars and activity. He had expected a simple car breakdown, not a crime scene. As Margaret gathered her purse and briefcase from her car, she thought about what would happen next. There would be an investigation. There would be media attention. There would be questions about how a federal judge could be treated this way by a police officer. What Margaret didn't know yet was that Officer Mitchell's body camera had captured everything. The racist language, the unprovoked assault, the abuse of police power. And by tomorrow morning, that video would be spreading across social media faster than anyone could control it. Margaret Williams was about to become the most famous victim of police brutality in America. Everything she had worked for during her 15-year career was about to be turned upside down by a few minutes of racist violence on a quiet street. The question was whether the justice system she had served so faithfully would now serve her when she needed it most. The emergency room at City General Hospital was busy that Tuesday night, but Margaret Williams was seen immediately. Word had already spread that a federal judge had been assaulted by a police officer. The medical staff treated her with extra care and respect, but Margaret could see the questions in their eyes. Dr. Sarah Chen examined Margaret's injuries carefully. The left side of her face was swollen and bruised. Her lip was cut from where she had bitten it when Officer Mitchell struck her. Dr. Chen took photographs for evidence and prescribed pain medication for the swelling. "Judge Williams, you're going to have significant bruising for about 2 weeks," Dr. Chen explained. "The good news is that there doesn't appear to be any permanent damage." David sat beside his wife's hospital bed, holding her hand. He was still angry about what had happened. As a successful doctor, David was used to being treated with respect by police officers. He couldn't imagine how Margaret must have felt being attacked by someone who was supposed to protect her. "We need to call a lawyer," David said. "I am a lawyer," Margaret replied with a weak smile. "You know what I mean. You need someone to represent you in this case. Someone who can make sure that officer pays for what he did." Margaret nodded. She knew David was right. Even though she understood the legal system better than most people, she needed an attorney who could focus on her case while she dealt with the emotional aftermath of the assault. While Margaret was at the hospital, the police department was dealing with a crisis. Chief Robert Thompson had been called at home and told about the incident involving Judge Williams. Thompson was a 25-year veteran who had worked hard to improve relations between police and the community. Thompson arrived at the police station at midnight. He immediately ordered that Officer Mitchell's body camera footage be preserved and secured. He also suspended Mitchell pending a full investigation. The chief knew that any incident involving a federal judge would receive intense scrutiny. The body camera footage was worse than Thompson had feared. It clearly showed Officer Mitchell using racial slurs and striking Judge Williams without cause. The video would be devastating if it became public. Thompson knew he had to act quickly to control the damage. The chief called District Attorney Patricia Hayes at home. Hayes had worked closely with Judge Williams for many years. She respected Margaret as one of the fairest judges in the federal system. When Thompson described what was on the video, Hayes was shocked. "We'll prosecute this case to the full extent of the law," Hayes promised. "No police officer is above the law, especially when it comes to assaulting a federal judge." But even as Hayes promised justice, she was thinking about the political implications. She was an elected official who depended on police union support. Prosecuting a police officer was always difficult, even when the evidence was clear. By Wednesday morning, news of the incident had reached the federal courthouse. Chief Judge Robert Carson called an emergency meeting of the Judicial Council. Carson had appointed Margaret to several important committees. He considered her one of his most valuable judges. "This is an attack on the entire federal judiciary," Carson told the other judges. "If police officers think they can assault federal judges with impunity, it undermines the rule of law itself." The other judges agreed that the incident was serious, but privately, some of them worried about the attention it would bring to the courthouse. Federal judges preferred to work quietly, away from media attention and political controversy. Margaret returned to work on Thursday morning, 2 days after the assault. She wore makeup to cover the worst of the bruising, but her swollen face was still noticeable. Her staff members were supportive, but she could see the concern in their eyes. Her first case that morning involved a civil rights lawsuit against the city police department. The irony was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. Here was a judge who had just been assaulted by a police officer, presiding over a case about police misconduct. The attorney representing the city police department looked uncomfortable throughout the hearing. He knew about the incident involving Judge Williams, and he wondered if she could still be fair in cases involving police officers. After the hearing, Margaret called Chief Judge Carson to discuss her situation. She wanted to know if she should recuse herself from cases involving law enforcement. "Margaret, you don't need to recuse yourself from anything," Carson said. "You were the victim of a crime. That doesn't disqualify you from doing your job." But, privately, Carson was worried. The incident was already attracting media attention. Reporters were starting to ask questions about what had happened on Oak Street. Carson knew that too much publicity could damage the reputation of the entire federal court system. The police union immediately began defending Officer Mitchell. Union President Tom Bradley held a press conference claiming that Mitchell was a dedicated officer who had been unfairly accused. Officer Mitchell was doing his job when he encountered a suspicious person in a high-crime area, Bradley said. He followed proper procedures and used appropriate force when the subject became hostile. Margaret watched the press conference from her office. She couldn't believe how the union was twisting the facts. Oak Street was not a high-crime area. She had not been hostile. Mitchell had used racial slurs and assaulted her without cause. The union's defense strategy became clear quickly. They would claim that Margaret had been uncooperative and aggressive. They would argue that Mitchell's actions were justified. They would try to put the victim on trial instead of the officer who had committed the assault. Margaret's attorney, James Patterson, was one of the best civil rights lawyers in the city. He had represented many victims of police brutality over the years, but he had never represented a federal judge before. "Judge Williams, I need you to understand that this case will be different from anything you've experienced," Patterson warned. "They're going to attack your credibility, your character, and your fitness to serve as a judge." "Why would they attack me? I'm the victim." "Because you're not just any victim. You're a powerful black woman who threatens their narrative about police officers always being right. They'll try to destroy you to protect their officer." Patterson was right. Within days, stories began appearing in conservative media questioning Margaret's judicial record. They claimed she was soft on crime and hostile to law enforcement. They dug up old cases where she had ruled against police officers or prosecutor. The stories were misleading and unfair, but they began to shape public opinion. Some people started to believe that Margaret had somehow brought the assault on herself by being disrespectful to Officer Mitchell. Margaret discovered that even some of her colleagues were beginning to distance themselves from her. Judge Robert Martinez, who had worked with Margaret for 10 years, stopped by her office on Friday afternoon. "Margaret, I think you should consider taking some time off until this situation is resolved," Martinez suggested. "Time off? Why would I take time off? I haven't done anything wrong." "I know that. But this case is creating a lot of controversy. Some people think it would be better if you stepped back until the media attention dies down." Margaret realized that Martinez was not offering friendly advice. He was delivering a message from other judges who wanted her to disappear until the scandal passed. They were more concerned about protecting the reputation of the court than supporting a colleague who had been assaulted. That evening, Margaret sat in her home office reviewing the events of the past week. Her face still hurt where Officer Mitchell had struck her. Her reputation was being attacked in the media. Some of her colleagues were suggesting she should hide until the controversy passed. For the first time in her career, Margaret Williams began to wonder if the justice system she had served so faithfully would really provide her with justice when she needed it most. The signs were already suggesting that protecting Officer Mitchell and the police department was more important than protecting a federal judge who had been the victim of a racist assault. The system's response was becoming clear. They would investigate the incident, but they would also try to minimize its significance. They would prosecute Officer Mitchell, but they would also question whether Margaret had somehow contributed to what happened. They would express support for her, but they would also suggest that she should keep a low profile. Margaret was beginning to understand that seeking justice for herself might cost her everything she had worked to build over 15 years on the federal bench. 3 weeks after the assault, Officer Mitchell's body camera footage was leaked to the media. Someone in the police department had given the video to a local television station, and by Monday morning, it was playing on every news channel in America. Margaret Williams watched the footage from her office at the federal courthouse. Seeing herself being called racial slurs and struck across the face was even more painful than living through it the first time. But she hoped the video would finally prove to everyone what really happened that night on Oak Street. The video was devastating evidence against Officer Mitchell. It showed him being aggressive and hostile from the beginning. It captured every racist word he used. It clearly showed him striking a federal judge who was standing peacefully beside her broken-down car. But the reaction to the video was not what Margaret had expected. Instead of universal outrage at Mitchell's behavior, the country became divided. Some people were horrified by what they saw and demanded justice for Judge Williams, but others defended Mitchell and claimed that Margaret had somehow provoked the attack. Conservative talk show hosts argued that Margaret had been disrespectful to a police officer doing his job. They said she had used her position as a judge to intimidate Mitchell. They claimed the video didn't show the full story and that Margaret must have done something off camera to deserve what happened. Social media exploded with arguments about the incident. Margaret's supporters used hashtags like Justice for Judge Williams and our police accountability, but her critics used hashtags like Back the Blue and Respect the Police. The country seemed more interested in taking sides than finding the truth. Political pressure began affecting Margaret's work immediately. Senator Richard Hayes, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, called Chief Judge Carson to express concerns about the controversy surrounding Judge Williams. "This situation is creating problems for all federal judges," Senator Hayes said. "People are starting to question whether Judge Williams can be fair in cases involving law enforcement." Chief Judge Carson defended Margaret, but he could hear the political calculation in Hayes's voice. The senator was worried about how the controversy might affect his own re-election campaign. Supporting a black judge who had been assaulted by a white police officer could cost him votes in conservative districts. The pressure on Margaret increased when the Judicial Conduct Committee announced They would investigate whether her behavior during the incident was appropriate for a federal judge. The committee claimed they needed to determine if Margaret had conducted herself with proper dignity during her encounter with Officer Mitchell. Margaret couldn't believe what was happening. She was the victim of a racist assault, but now she was being investigated for her own conduct. It was like being punished for being attacked. Her attorney, James Patterson, tried to prepare her for what was coming. Judge Williams, they're going to argue that you should have been more submissive with Officer Mitchell. They'll say a federal judge should have set a better example by not arguing with a police officer. So I should have let him search my car, illegally. I should have accepted his racist treatment without saying anything. I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's what they'll argue. They want to find a way to blame you for what happened. The investigation into Margaret's conduct was led by Judge Harold Morrison, a conservative judge from Texas who had never liked Margaret's liberal rulings. Morrison had opposed her appointment to several judicial committees. Now he had the power to review her entire career. Morrison's committee requested Margaret's judicial records for the past 5 years. They wanted to examine every case where she had ruled against police officers or prosecutors. They were looking for a pattern of bias against law enforcement. The committee also requested Margaret's personnel file and any complaints that had ever been filed against her. In 15 years on the bench, only 3 minor complaints had been filed, and all had been dismissed as frivolous. But Morrison's committee treated them as if they were serious concerns. Margaret's colleagues began treating her differently. Some judges stopped including her in their informal meetings. Others avoided eating lunch with her in the judge's dining room. A few continued to support her, but many seemed to view her as a problem that needed to be contained. The change was most noticeable in how court staff treated her. Her law clerks remained loyal, but some of the administrative staff became cool and distant. Margaret realized that word had spread through the courthouse that she was in trouble with the Judicial Conduct Committee. The media attention was relentless. Reporters camped outside the courthouse every day, hoping to get a comment from Judge Williams. They followed her to lunch, to court proceedings, and even to her home. Margaret felt like a prisoner in her own life. Conservative media figures began attacking Margaret's judicial record. They found cases where she had ruled in favor of civil rights plaintiffs against police departments. They claimed these rulings showed she was biased against law enforcement and unfit to be a judge. What they didn't mention was that Margaret had also ruled in favor of police officers and prosecutors in hundreds of other cases. They ignored the fact that she had a reputation for fairness among lawyers on both sides. They cherry-picked a few cases to create a false narrative about her judicial philosophy. The attacks on Margaret's character became personal and vicious. Some websites published articles questioning how she had gotten her job as a federal judge. They suggested she was an affirmative action appointment who wasn't qualified for her position. Margaret had dealt with racism throughout her career, but this felt different. The attacks were coordinated and systematic. Someone was organizing a campaign to destroy her reputation and force her off the bench. Her husband David was also affected by the controversy. Some of his medical colleagues began treating him differently. A few patients requested different doctors because they didn't want to be treated by the husband of that judge who hates police. The stress began affecting Margaret's health. She had trouble sleeping and lost her appetite. The constant media attention made her feel anxious and depressed. For the first time in her career, she began to dread going to work each morning. The breaking point came when Margaret received a death threat in her office mail. The letter contained racist language and threatened to kill her if she didn't resign from the bench. The FBI investigated the threat, but they warned Margaret that more threats were likely. Security at the courthouse was increased. Margaret now had to enter and leave through a different entrance to avoid reporters and protesters. She felt like she was being punished for being the victim of a crime. Chief Judge Carson called Margaret to his office on a Friday afternoon. His expression was serious and uncomfortable. Margaret knew this was not going to be a friendly conversation. "Margaret, I need to talk to you about your situation," Carson began. "The Judicial Conduct Committee is putting pressure on me to take action." "What kind of action?" "They want you to consider taking a temporary leave of absence until the investigation is complete. and the criminal case against Officer Mitchell is resolved. Margaret felt her stomach drop. You want me to step down? Not permanently. Just until this controversy dies down. Robert, I'm the victim here. I was assaulted by a racist police officer. Why should I be the one who has to leave? Carson looked uncomfortable. It's not about right or wrong, Margaret. It's about practical politics. Your presence on the bench is creating problems for the entire federal court system. Margaret realized that even her strongest ally was abandoning her. Chief Judge Carson cared more about avoiding controversy than protecting a judge who had been the victim of a violent crime. That evening, Margaret sat in her home office thinking about her options. She could fight the Judicial Conduct Committee and try to keep her position. But the investigation would drag on for months and the media attention would continue. Her effectiveness as a judge was already compromised, or she could take the leave of absence and hope that things would improve over time. But Margaret suspected that once she stepped down, it would be very difficult to get her position back. Her enemies would use any excuse to keep her off the bench permanently. For the first time since the night Officer Mitchell struck her, Margaret Williams began to consider the possibility that her career as a federal judge might be over. The system she had served faithfully for 15 years was slowly but systematically destroying her for having the courage to seek justice when she was wronged. 6 months after the assault, Margaret Williams's world had completely changed. The Judicial Conduct Committee had expanded their investigation to include her entire 15-year career on the bench. What started as a review of one incident had become a comprehensive attack on her fitness to serve as a federal judge. Judge Harold Morrison, who led the investigation, had found allies among conservative legal organizations. The Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society provided research support to help build a case against Margaret. They claimed they were protecting the integrity of the federal judiciary, but Margaret knew they were trying to remove a liberal black judge from the bench. The committee had discovered that Margaret had once attended a civil rights conference where speakers criticized police brutality. They treated this as evidence that she was biased against law enforcement. They ignored the fact that hundreds of judges, prosecutors, and police chiefs had attended the same conference. They also questioned Margaret's membership in the National Bar Association, an organization for black lawyers. The committee suggested that belonging to a racially oriented professional group showed she couldn't be fair to white defendants. This argument was absurd, but it was included in their official report. Margaret's case assignments had been quietly reduced over the past several months. Chief Judge Carson claimed it was temporary, but Margaret noticed she was no longer getting important cases. Her once busy docket had been replaced with routine matters that any judge could handle. The change was most obvious in high-profile cases. Margaret used to handle major civil rights lawsuits, complex business disputes, and significant criminal cases. Now she was assigned traffic violations, small contract disputes, and routine sentencing hearings. Her law clerks had also been reassigned. Margaret's chambers, which used to buzz with activity, was now quiet and nearly empty. She felt like she was being erased from the courthouse where she had once been one of the most respected judges. The media campaign against Margaret intensified as Officer Mitchell's criminal trial approached. Conservative news outlets published daily stories questioning her character and judicial record. They interviewed former defendants who claimed she had been unfair to them. They spoke with police officers who said they didn't trust her to be impartial. Most of these stories were based on half-truths and deliberate misrepresentations, but they created a narrative that Margaret was an activist judge who hated police and favored criminals. The constant repetition of these lies began to convince some people that they were true. Margaret's supporters tried to defend her, but they were outnumbered and outspent. Civil rights organizations issued statements supporting her, but their voices were drowned out by the well-funded conservative media machine that was working to destroy her reputation. The attacks on Margaret began affecting other areas of her life. She resigned from the board of a local charity after several major donors threatened to withdraw their support. A university that had planned to give her an honorary degree quietly withdrew the invitation. Even her neighborhood began to feel hostile. Someone had spray-painted racist graffiti on her garage door. Her home security system captured strangers taking pictures of her house. She and David considered moving, but they refused to be driven from the home they loved. The stress was taking a serious toll on Margaret's health. Her doctor prescribed medication for high blood pressure and anxiety. She had developed stomach problems from the constant stress. David worried that the campaign against his wife was literally making her sick. Margaret's relationship with her colleagues deteriorated further when Judge Morrison's committee released their preliminary findings. The report criticized Margaret for conduct unbecoming a federal judge during her encounter with Officer Mitchell. The committee claimed that Margaret should have been more respectful to Officer Mitchell, even though he was treating her illegally. They said her assertion of her rights as a citizen and her position as a judge showed arrogance and disrespect for law enforcement. The report completely ignored the racist language Mitchell had used. It dismissed his physical assault as a regrettable escalation that might have been avoided if Margaret had been more cooperative. The committee seemed to believe that being polite to racist police officers was more important than defending constitutional rights. Margaret's attorney, James Patterson, called the report a disgraceful whitewash that blames the victim for being assaulted. But Patterson's criticism received little media attention. The conservative outlets that had promoted the investigation barely covered the defense response. Chief Judge Carson called Margaret to his office again, this time with a more serious ultimatum. The pressure from Washington was increasing, and several senators had suggested that Margaret should resign for the good of the federal judiciary. "Margaret, I've been fighting for you, but I'm running out of options," Carson said. "The committee is going to recommend your removal from the bench, unless you agree to resign voluntarily." "On what grounds?" "They're claiming judicial misconduct based on your behavior during the incident with Officer Mitchell." Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. "My behavior? I was the victim of a racist assault." "I know that, but the committee sees it differently. They think you provoked the incident by being disrespectful to a police officer. So if a white male judge had been treated the same way, would the committee be investigating him?" Carson looked uncomfortable. "That's not a fair comparison." "Why not? Because I'm black? Because I'm a woman? Because I refuse to accept racist treatment quietly?" "Margaret, please don't make this about race." "How can I not make this about race? Everything that's happened to me has been about race from the moment Officer Mitchell saw me in that car." The conversation ended badly. Carson made it clear that Margaret's position was no longer sustainable. She could resign voluntarily and maintain some dignity, or she could fight the committee and face a public removal proceeding that would destroy whatever reputation she had left. Margaret's few remaining allies urged her to fight. Judge Sarah Martinez from the Ninth Circuit called to offer support. "Margaret, if you give up now, they'll do this to every judge who stands up for civil rights. You have to fight." But Margaret was exhausted. The constant attacks had worn her down. She was spending more time defending herself than doing her job. The stress was affecting her marriage and her health. She wasn't sure she had the strength to continue fighting a system that seemed determined to destroy her. The final blow came when Officer Mitchell's criminal trial ended in a plea bargain. Instead of facing serious charges for assaulting a federal, Judge Mitchell pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor and was sentenced to 6 months in jail. He would be eligible for parole in 3 months. The plea deal was negotiated without consulting Margaret. District Attorney Patricia Hayes claimed it was the best outcome they could achieve, but Margaret suspected the DA was more interested in avoiding a controversial trial than seeking real justice. Mitchell's light sentence sent a clear message to Margaret and everyone watching her case. A police officer could assault a federal judge, use racist language, and violate her constitutional rights, and the punishment would be minimal. Meanwhile, the judge who was attacked would be investigated, criticized, and possibly removed from the bench. That evening, Margaret sat in her empty chambers looking at the commendations and awards that covered her office walls. 15 years of dedicated service to the law meant nothing when the legal system wanted to get rid of her. She thought about her parents and the civil rights battles they had fought in the 1960s. They had believed that progress was possible, that education and hard work could overcome racism and injustice. Margaret had believed that too. But now she wondered if anything had really changed. The system had found a way to destroy her without appearing obviously racist. They used procedural rules and professional standards to accomplish what they couldn't do directly. They made her the problem instead of addressing the racism that had caused her assault. Margaret Williams realized that her career as a federal judge was probably over. The only question now was whether she would resign voluntarily or force them to remove her. Either way, 15 years of faithful service to justice was about to end because she had refused to accept racist treatment quietly. 18 months after Officer Derek Mitchell struck her on Oak Street, Margaret Williams sat in her home office writing her resignation letter from the federal bench. The morning sun streamed through the windows, but she felt only darkness as she chose the words that would end her 15-year judicial career. The letter was simple and dignified. Margaret did not admit to any wrongdoing because she had done nothing wrong. She did not apologize for defending her constitutional rights because those rights were fundamental to American democracy. She simply stated that continuing to serve as a federal judge was no longer possible given the circumstances. After careful consideration, I have decided to resign my position as United States District Judge, effective immediately, she wrote. It has been an honor to serve the people of this district and to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Margaret did not mention the racist assault that had started her downfall. She did not describe the coordinated campaign to destroy her reputation. She did not explain how the justice system had failed her when she needed it most. She maintained her dignity even in defeat. The resignation letter would be delivered to Chief Judge Carson that afternoon. By evening, it would be public knowledge that Judge Margaret Williams was leaving the federal bench. The conservative media outlets that had attacked her for months would claim victory. The legal establishment that had abandoned her would express polite regret. David sat beside his wife as she finished the letter. He had watched the woman he loved be slowly destroyed by a system she had served faithfully. The stress had aged her years in just 18 months. Her hair had turned gray, and she had lost weight from the constant anxiety. "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" David asked. "I don't want to do this," Margaret replied. "But I don't have any choice left. If I stay and fight, they'll remove me anyway. At least this way I can leave with some dignity." The Judicial Conduct Committee had made it clear that they intended to recommend her removal from the bench. Judge Morrison had told reporters that Margaret's conduct during the incident with Officer Mitchell showed she was unfit to serve as a federal judge. The committee's final report would be released next week. Margaret had seen a draft copy, and it was even worse than she had expected. The committee blamed her for everything that had happened. They claimed she had provoked Officer Mitchell by being disrespectful. They suggested she was biased against law enforcement and could not be trusted to handle cases involving police officers. The report completely ignored the racist language Mitchell had used. It dismissed his physical assault as a minor incident that Margaret had exaggerated. It turned the victim into the perpetrator, and the perpetrator into the victim. Margaret's few remaining supporters had urged her to fight the committee's findings. Civil rights organizations promised to fund her legal defense. Some legal scholars wrote articles defending her right to assert her constitutional rights during a police encounter. But Margaret was tired of fighting. The constant attacks had worn her down. She was spending all her time defending herself instead of doing the job she loved. The stress was affecting her health and her marriage. She couldn't continue living this way. The decision to resign was also practical. Margaret knew that the Senate would never confirm another liberal black woman to replace her as long as Republicans controlled the chamber. By resigning now, she would at least allow President Biden to nominate her replacement, while Democrats still had some influence. Margaret's replacement would probably be a moderate white judge who wouldn't threaten anyone's comfort. The position she had used to advance civil rights and protect constitutional freedoms would go to someone who would avoid controversy at all costs. Officer Mitchell had served only 3 months in jail before being released on parole. He had been quietly transferred to a police department in a small town where his assault on a federal judge was seen as a badge of honor rather than a crime. He would continue his law enforcement career while Margaret's judicial career was ending. The inequality of their outcomes was stark. Mitchell had committed a racist assault and faced minimal consequences. Margaret had been the victim of that assault and lost everything she had worked to achieve. The system had protected the perpetrator and punished the victim. As Margaret prepared to submit her resignation, she thought about the young black lawyers she had mentored over the years. She wondered what message her downfall would send to them. Would they still believe they could succeed in the legal profession if they saw how easily a federal judge could be destroyed? She also thought about future victims of police brutality. Would they be willing to seek justice if they knew that even a federal judge could be punished for asserting her rights? Margaret's case had sent a clear message that challenging police misconduct was dangerous, even for people in positions of power. The conservative legal movement that had orchestrated Margaret's downfall was already celebrating their victory. They had successfully removed a liberal black judge from the federal bench without appearing obviously racist. They had used procedural rules and professional standards to accomplish what they couldn't do directly. Their success with Margaret would encourage them to target other judges who made decisions they didn't like. Any judge who ruled in favor of civil rights plaintiffs or against police officers would know they could face the same treatment Margaret had endured. Margaret's law clerks came to her chambers that afternoon to say goodbye. They were young lawyers who had hoped to learn about justice from one of the most respected judges in the country. Instead, they had learned how the justice system could be used to destroy the people who believed in it most. Judge Williams, this isn't right, said Sarah Chen, her senior law clerk. You're one of the best judges I've ever worked with. You don't deserve what they've done to you. Thank you, Sarah. But sometimes doing the right thing comes with a price. I hope you'll remember that when you have your own law career. Margaret's colleagues held a small farewell ceremony in the judges' conference room. Only about half of the federal judges attended. Some who came seemed uncomfortable, as if Margaret's presence reminded them of their own failure to support her when she needed help. Chief Judge Carson made polite remarks about Margaret's service to the court. He did not mention why she was leaving or acknowledge that she had been the victim of a racist assault. He treated her resignation as a normal retirement, rather than the result of a coordinated campaign to destroy her. The local bar association issued a statement praising Margaret's 15 years of service. Several civil rights organizations held a dinner in her honor, but these gestures felt hollow to Margaret. The same legal community that was now praising her had largely abandoned her when she was under attack. Margaret's final day as a federal judge was quiet and anticlimactic. She cleaned out her office, packed her personal belongings, and said goodbye to the staff members who had supported her. She looked around her chambers one last time, remembering the important cases she had decided and the lives she had touched. As she walked out of the federal courthouse for the last time, Margaret thought about the young woman who had first put on a judge's robe 15 years earlier. That woman had believed the legal system could be fair and just for everyone. She had been naive. The legal system was fair and just for some people, but not for others. It protected those who fit in and followed unwritten rules about staying quiet when they were mistreated. It punished those who demanded that the Constitution mean what it said for everyone. Margaret Williams had learned this lesson too late to save her career, but not too late to understand the truth about American justice. Some people were expected to accept injustice quietly, and anyone who refused to do so would be destroyed by the very system they had tried to serve. 6 months after Margaret's resignation, Officer Derek Mitchell was promoted to sergeant in his new police department. He received a commendation for his dedicated service to law enforcement. The incident that had ended Margaret's career was treated as a minor footnote in his personnel file. The conservative media outlets that had destroyed Margaret's reputation moved on to other targets. The legal establishment that had abandoned her filled her position with a judge who would never challenge anyone's comfort. The system had successfully protected itself by sacrificing the person who had dared to demand justice. Margaret Williams started a small civil rights law practice in her hometown in Alabama. She represented victims of police brutality and discrimination. She couldn't change the system from the bench anymore, but she could still fight for justice in her own way. Sometimes she wondered what would have happened if she had remained silent that night on Oak Street. If she had accepted Officer Mitchell's racist treatment without protest. If she had been the kind of victim the system preferred, quiet, submissive, and grateful for whatever justice she was given. But Margaret knew she had made the right choice. She had stood up for her rights and her dignity, even when it cost her everything. That was more important than keeping a job in a system that didn't really want her anyway. The federal courthouse where Margaret had served for 15 years looked the same as it always had. The marble walls still proclaimed that justice was equal under law.